started collecting the books that I have now with intention, like around 2019, I would say. I started to meet more like other queer and trans Jews, and I spent a lot of time in the States, in the US, and people introduced me to books I had never really heard of before, that were talking about like queer Judaism or trans Judaism or all those things in either Jewish practice or Jewish history, or like understanding Judaism through those lenses. And it was really, so I would like come back home to Montreal and try to get these books, and no public libraries had them. I ended up either being gifted a lot of those books or reading them, and they really had a big impact on me, and made Judaism kind of not more relatable, but like added another layer of meaning that I felt was kept from me as like a queer and trans person, like being able to understand Judaism through those lenses or learn history. It meant a lot to me, and I wanted to share that with my community, but there was such a barrier to being able to access them. And so I just started collecting them. I mean, I think like firstly, just about something Jewish. I know there's a question of like, oh, if a Jewish author writes a Jewish book, is it a Jewish book? I'm not really into like deciding those things for other people. Like if a Jewish author writes a book and they're like, it's not really a Jewish book, I don't really care to argue with that. Yeah, I think it's just a book that's about something Jewish, whether it's spirituality or liturgy or history or food, whatever it is. Yeah, I would say a lot of the books that I'm really excited about right now are a lot of stories, both histories and personal narratives that have been written by or about Jews in the Middle East and North Africa. The two books that I brought today. One of them is about that, and the other one is just like this really incredible anthology of queer Jewish texts from like almost 2,000 years. So it's that was like a really like formative book that came out that I think really changed people's access to being able to read about queerness in Jewish history, because it's all primary sources. So I'm also like a history teacher and a history nerd, and so I think there's something really powerful both about like personal stories. So When We Were Arabs is a personal narrative of family history, and then also like primary documents. So things that like were written in a given time period. Like I also understand that those narratives missing as like political choices, you know, like, oh, I went to Jewish day school and I never learned anything about queer Jews or trans Jews, or I happened to go to school with a lot of Jewish Arabs, but it wasn't part of the like education for us to learn that history, especially through a political lens of, you know, how is that history related to Zionism in Palestine as well? Mm-hmm. And so I just want us to talk about it more. I'm also a teacher. So in my day job, when I'm not doing this kind of community organizing. So I think a lot about education, like how did I get to where I am today? How did I get to my understanding of how the world works, why things are the way they are, what is like effective change, how do we care for each other well, how do we like undo systems of harm, and a lot of that is through learning. Like we learn by reading, we learn from each other, we learn by experiencing alternatives to those systems in community, and books have really shaped me in that. So it's also just kind of like I want to make that accessible to other people also. So those are the two books that I brought. One of them is called When We Were Arabs, A Jewish Family's Forgotten History by Masoud Hayyoun. And that book is incredible. It really like kind of coalesced a lot, just so much of like what I've been thinking about recently in terms of histories of Jewish assimilation, histories of the loss of Arab Judaism, colonialism in the world, Zionism. It's so powerful, and it's like an extremely political book, and it's also written through a person's family lineage, which I really relate to. If Oscar and Daida stand out in our family line, it is because they were the last generation to witness Jewish Arabness before exile. Colonial era policy in the Arab world aimed to divorce Jewish Arabs not just from other Arabs, but from other Jewish Arabs. The colonizers envisioned family trees in which Jewish Arabs became progressively less Arab with each generation and imposed policies to that effect. It's like really, I think, an integral piece to understanding like what is happening in Palestine. And truly also like for Jews, especially Jews of Arab lineage, to process the like incredible loss that's happened to our families and our culture, which was like quite recent. Like most Jewish Arabs went mostly to Palestine like as of the 50s, maybe even the 80s. And a lot of that was like part of the project of like moving a lot of Jews to Palestine. So it's really intense, and it's a history that absolutely almost nobody talks about, and especially not in the like mainstream Jewish community. And I think there's like a lot. I also operate from a place of like centering grief and grief work, and personally I've learned a lot about my family and how I relate to like politically what's happening in Palestine through processing like grief in my own family lineage and trying to understand like why don't I know anything about my Jewish Arab ancestors, and how does that relate to making sure that like Jews aren't seen as Arabs, and like in Israel, like Arabs are the other, and so how have we like distanced ourselves from our own identity and experience in order to like other and like quite violently do that to other people. So yeah, this is like truly a book that I continue to pass on to like anyone who will let me get them to read it. And so I think that quote really just kind of very succinctly and dramatically expresses, I think, the core thesis of this book. I tried to bring two books because I'm like, there is, you know, like Arab Jewish history and colonialism that like thread through to Palestine that I really want to talk about. And then there's also like queerness and transness. It's a compilation of primary sources from the 1st century to 1969, compiled by Noam Siena. If you want to read specifically through the lens of identity, this is where you can find sources about gender transition. Or if you want to read about women loving women, these are all the sources about that. Or maybe you want to read this book through the lens of geography, and here are all the sources that are about Sephardic Jews. Or here are all the stories about Jews in the Middle East and Persia and North Africa. Or here are all the stories about Jews in Eastern Europe and its diaspora. And so it's really like incredibly done, and the stories are incredible. I chose just 3 titles that I thought would illustrate like what it might be like to read this book. So the first one is called A Gender Bending Jewish Runaway Arrives in New France, which is written on September 15th, 1738, and it was the Procès Verbal is a transcript about somebody's like interrogation that they experienced in New France. This person came to Quebec as a man and worked here as a man, and then was outed both as a woman and a Jew in New France, in colonial New France, and then is sent home back to France, I believe. And it's also really complicated. It's like, oh yeah, Jews were involved in like colonial process here, and so it's just there's so much in these stories that I've never gotten to learn about or talk about, right? Like, let's talk about Jewish role in colonization. Let's talk about like trans experience, or let's talk about how we might like apply something that would be like a label that might not have actually been that person's experience. Like maybe this person wasn't trans, maybe this person was just trying to get access to more work, or maybe, you know, the ways that we understand identity today have really changed over time. And it's the book does a really amazing job of like not putting like modern understandings of identities onto these people. It's just like, here's what I found, and like it's important that we have access to reading them. So that's one story. Another one, I won't go into depth of the other two, but another text is called An Ottoman Sephardi Rabbi Rules on Gender Transition in Izmir in 1896, which I feel like, you know, we don't think about how was the Jewish community navigating transness throughout its history. And then another text is called Two Amorous Men Cause a Brawl in the Synagogue in Jerusalem in the year 1052. So, I never got to read those stories. Like, what was like queer drama like in Jerusalem in the 11th century? So this book is like really, really a treasure. It's like such a deeply Jewish question. I have like all of Jewish history and like everyone's ancestors just being like, yes. Like, as a people of the book, I feel like preserving text is so important. Like, we organize our whole Jewish year around a text like the Torah. And in particular, I mean, I don't know, I'm thinking of so many things. I'm thinking about the burning of Magnus Hirschfeld's archives during Nazi rule in Germany. He had an archive, both a clinic and a cultural center and an archive in Berlin called the Institute for Sexual Studies, I believe. I think it was like the first institute of its kind, an archive for like queer and trans people. And he was a gay Jew. And he did like truly incredible work. And the Nazis knew that, and how powerful that was. And it was like liberatory to all the communities or many of the communities that the Nazis tried to destroy. And so they actually, while Magnus Hirschfeld was out of the country, they burned his entire archive. Book burnings are so powerful because of like what books mean to people, or like it's done because of like how like crucial that access is.